The first light of dawn painted the Afghan mountains in soft orange and pink colors. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stood outside the briefing tent at Forward Operating Base Chapman. She breathed in the cold mountain air and watched the sun slowly rise above the rocky peaks. At 28 years old, Maria had already spent more time in these dangerous mountains than most soldiers twice her age. Her brown eyes scanned the horizon with the sharp focus of someone who had learned to spot danger from miles away. Maria was different from the other soldiers at the base. While they spent their free time playing cards or video games, she practiced tracking skills her grandfather had taught her as a child in the forests of East Texas. Her grandfather, Roberto Santos, had been a hunter and tracker who could follow a deer trail through the thickest woods. He taught young Maria how to read signs in nature that others missed completely. A bent blade of grass could tell her which direction someone had walked. A small scratch on a rock could show her where someone had climbed. These skills seemed old-fashioned in an age of high-tech military equipment, but Maria knew they had saved her life more than once. She walked into the briefing tent where 12 other soldiers sat waiting. The air inside was thick with the smell of strong coffee and nervous sweat. Major Williams, a tall man with gray hair and serious eyes, stood at the front near a large map of the region. Red circles marked enemy positions while blue arrows showed their planned route. Maria took her usual seat in the back row and pulled out a small notebook to write down important details. Major Williams cleared his throat and began speaking in his deep, commanding voice. The mission was supposed to be straightforward. Intelligence reports showed that a high-level Taliban commander named Hassan al-Mahmoud was hiding in a compound about 20 miles north of their position. This man had been responsible for planning attacks that killed dozens of American and Afghan soldiers over the past year. Navy SEAL Team 6 would handle the capture, while Maria and 2 other Army soldiers provided communication support and watched for enemy reinforcements. The plan looked good on paper. They would fly in 2 Black Hawk helicopters under cover of darkness. The SEALs would fast rope down near the compound while Maria and her team set up an observation post on a nearby hill. From there, they could watch the surrounding area and radio warnings if enemy fighters approached. The whole operation should take no more than 2 hours from start to finish. They would be back at base before most soldiers finished their morning coffee. Maria studied the map carefully and noticed something that bothered her. The compound sat in a narrow valley surrounded by high cliffs and rocky outcrops. It was the perfect place for an ambush if the enemy knew they were coming. She raised her hand and asked Major Williams about escape routes if things went wrong. He pointed to several paths marked on the map, but Maria could see they all led through choke points where a few enemy fighters could pin down a much larger force. After the briefing ended, Maria gathered her equipment with the methodical care of someone who had learned that small mistakes could mean death. She checked her M4 rifle, making sure it was clean and properly loaded. Her radio went through a complete function test to ensure clear communication. She packed extra batteries, medical supplies, and water purification tablets. Her grandfather had always said that preparation was the difference between coming home and becoming a story other people told. The other soldiers assigned to her team were Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez and Corporal Lisa Chen. Rodriguez was a communications specialist from California who could fix almost any piece of electronic equipment. Chen was a medic from Oregon who had already saved several lives during her deployment. Both were good soldiers, but neither had Maria's experience in the mountains or her ability to move silently through dangerous territory. As afternoon turned to evening, Maria felt the familiar mixture of excitement and fear that came before every mission. She had been on dozens of operations during her 3 tours in Afghanistan, but each one still made her heart beat faster. The smart soldiers were always a little scared, because fear kept you alert and alive. The soldiers who stopped being scared were usually the ones who made fatal mistakes. She spent the final hours before departure cleaning her weapons one more time and reviewing the mission plan. The intelligence seemed solid, and the SEAL team was among the best in the military. Everything should go exactly as planned. But Maria had learned that in war, things rarely went according to plan. The enemy always seemed to know more than the intelligence reports suggested. Weather could change suddenly in the mountains, turning a simple mission into a fight for survival. As darkness fell across the base, Maria walked to the helicopter landing zone with her team. 2 Blackhawks sat waiting, their rotors already spinning slowly. The pilots performed final checks while crew chiefs loaded ammunition and emergency supplies. The SEALs were easy to spot even in the dim light. They moved with the quiet confidence of warriors who had completed hundreds of similar missions. Maria climbed into the helicopter and strapped herself into the canvas seat. The metal floor vibrated under her boots as the engines powered up to full strength. She looked around at the other soldiers, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Some closed their eyes and tried to rest during the flight. Others checked their equipment one final time or studied photographs of the target area. The helicopter lifted off smoothly and banked toward the mountains. Through the small window, Maria watched the lights of the base grow smaller and disappear into the darkness below. Soon there was nothing but black mountains and star-filled sky stretching in every direction. The flight would take 45 minutes, giving her time to mentally prepare for whatever waited ahead in those dangerous peaks. Maria closed her eyes and thought about her grandfather's lessons about patience and observation. Tonight she would need both skills more than she could possibly imagine. The helicopter flew through the night sky like a metal bird hunting in the darkness. Maria felt the steady vibration of the rotors above her head and watched the other soldiers in the dim red light of the cabin. Some tried to sleep while others stared out the small windows at the black mountains below. The flight had been smooth for 30 minutes when she noticed the pilot speaking urgently into his headset. Chief Warrant Officer Jake Thompson had been flying helicopters in Afghanistan for 2 years. He knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. But tonight something was different. A thick wall of fog was rolling in from the north, moving faster than the weather reports had predicted. The white mist crept between the mountain peaks like ghostly fingers reaching across the valleys. Thompson tried to fly around the fog bank, but it stretched for miles in every direction. The mission required them to reach the target area before dawn, leaving no time to wait for the weather to clear. He made a difficult decision and spoke into his radio to inform the other helicopter. They would have to land early and continue the mission on foot. The Black Hawk descended through swirling clouds that made it impossible to see more than 50 feet ahead. Thompson relied on his instruments and years of experience to find a safe landing spot. The helicopter touched down heavily on a rocky plateau, 2 miles south of their planned insertion point. The second helicopter landed nearby, its rotors whipping the fog into wild spirals. Maria grabbed her gear and jumped out onto the rough ground. The fog was so thick she could barely see the other soldiers even when they stood right next to her. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Stone, the SEAL team leader, gathered everyone together and quickly changed the plan. They would have to move through unfamiliar terrain in near-zero visibility to reach their target. The group began walking north through the rocky landscape. Maria used her compass and moved carefully over the uneven ground. Sharp rocks tried to trip her with every step, while the fog made it impossible to see obstacles until she was almost on top of them. The SEALs moved with practiced silence despite the difficult conditions. Rodriguez and Chen stayed close behind Maria, trusting her navigation skills to keep them on the right path. After an hour of slow progress, the fog began to thin slightly. Maria could see the dark shapes of cliffs rising on both sides of their route. They were walking through a narrow valley that wound between towering rock walls. Something felt wrong about this place. Her grandfather had taught her to trust her instincts when they warned of danger, and every instinct was screaming at her now. The attack came without warning from 3 directions at once. Muzzle flashes lit up the cliffs above them like deadly fireworks. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed between the rock walls while bullets whined past their heads and sparked off stones. Maria threw herself behind a large boulder as the hillsides erupted with enemy gunfire. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked down from the eastern cliff and exploded 30 yards to her left. The blast threw dirt and rocks in every direction while the shockwave slammed into her chest like an invisible hammer. Another RPG hit closer, filling the air with flying debris and choking dust. Maria pressed herself against the cold stone and tried to figure out where the attacks were coming from. The SEALs returned fire immediately, their weapons chattering in controlled bursts toward the enemy positions. Lieutenant Colonel Stone shouted orders over the noise of battle, while his men moved to find better cover. Rodriguez was calling for helicopter support on his radio, but the thick fog made it impossible for aircraft to provide help. More explosions shook the ground around Maria's position. A piece of shrapnel cut across her forehead, and warm blood began running down into her left eye. She wiped it away and looked for her teammates but could see nothing through the smoke and dust. The sound of gunfire seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. A massive explosion erupted directly behind Maria's boulder. The blast picked her up and threw her sideways into a crevice between two large rocks. Her ears rang so loudly she could not hear anything else. Dust and smoke filled her lungs, making it hard to breathe. When she tried to stand up, the world spun around her like a carnival ride gone wrong. Maria lay still for several minutes until her head cleared enough to think properly. She called out for Rodriguez and Chen but heard no answer. The gunfire had moved farther away, suggesting the battle was continuing in another part of the valley. She climbed carefully out of the crevice and looked around for any sign of her team. Her radio had been damaged in the explosion and would not turn on. The antenna was bent and the case was cracked. Maria was alone in enemy territory with no way to contact her unit. She could still hear occasional gunshots in the distance, but they were getting fainter as the fighting moved away from her position. Back at Forward Operating Base Chapman, Major Williams paced nervously in the command center. The mission had been out of radio contact for over an hour. Surveillance drones flying over the target area showed signs of a major battle, but the thick fog made it impossible to see what was happening on the ground. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the intelligence officer, reported what the drones had observed. Thermal imaging showed several heat signatures that could be bodies lying motionless in the valley. There were clear signs of explosions and weapons fire, but no movement from friendly forces. The fog was finally clearing, allowing the drones to get better pictures of the battlefield. The images were not encouraging. Scattered equipment and weapons lay among the rocks where the ambush had taken place. Several dark stains on the ground looked like blood. One drone operator thought he could see a damaged radio and pieces of military gear that matched what Maria's team had been carrying. Major Williams made one of the hardest decisions of his military career. After hours of searching and no contact from any team members, he had to assume the worst. The mission had failed, and good soldiers had paid the ultimate price. He walked slowly to his desk and began typing the casualty report that would list Staff Sergeant Maria Santos as killed in action. Maria was very much alive, but she was alone in the most dangerous place on Earth. Maria slowly opened her eyes and found herself staring at a gray sky through a crack between two massive rocks. Her head pounded like someone was hitting it with a hammer, and the taste of blood filled her mouth. She tried to remember where she was and what had happened. The memories came back in pieces like a puzzle being put together one fragment at a time. The ambush, the explosions, the sound of her teammates calling for help before everything went silent. Maria carefully moved her arms and legs to check for serious injuries. Her left shoulder ached terribly and blood had dried on her forehead, but nothing seemed to be broken. She was alive when she should have been dead, and that meant she had been given a second chance. Maria climbed slowly out of the narrow crevice where the explosion had thrown her. The valley looked completely different in daylight. Burned patches of earth marked where grenades had exploded. Pieces of military equipment lay scattered among the rocks like broken toys. She searched carefully for any sign of Rodriguez or Chen, but found only empty ammunition casings and torn fabric. The silence was the worst part. No voices calling for help, no radio chatter, no sounds of helicopters coming to rescue them. Maria was alone in a place where American soldiers were shot on sight. She had no working radio, limited ammunition, and enemy fighters could appear at any moment. Most soldiers would have panicked, but Maria's grandfather had prepared her for situations like this. Roberto Santos had taken his granddaughter deep into the East Texas forests many times when she was young. He taught her that panic was the enemy of survival. Stay calm, think clearly, and use what nature provides. Those lessons seemed more important now than all her military training combined. Maria found a hidden spot between two boulders and took inventory of her remaining supplies. She had 3 full magazines for her rifle, a combat knife, a small first aid kit, 2 water bottles, and some energy bars. Not much to survive in hostile territory, but her grandfather had once lived for a week in the wilderness with nothing but a knife and his knowledge of the land. She cleaned the cut on her forehead using water from one of her bottles and a bandage from her first aid kit. The wound was not deep, but head injuries bled heavily and could attract attention from enemy patrols. Maria tied a piece of cloth around her forehead to keep the bleeding stopped and dirt out of the cut. The sun was already high in the sky, which meant she had been unconscious for several hours. Enemy fighters would be searching the area for survivors, and moving during daylight was extremely dangerous. Maria decided to wait until evening before attempting to find her way back to friendly territory. She spent the afternoon studying the terrain and planning the safest route through the mountains. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Maria heard something that made her heart race. Voices were speaking English somewhere below her position. She grabbed her rifle and moved carefully toward the sound, using every bit of stealth her grandfather had taught her. The voices were coming from a cluster of rocks about 200 yards down the slope. Maria crawled on her belly through the loose stones and dry brush, stopping frequently to listen and watch for movement. The voices became clearer as she got closer. Two men were talking in low tones about their injuries and wondering if rescue helicopters would find them. These were definitely American soldiers, but Maria had to be absolutely certain before revealing her position. She worked her way around to a spot where she could see into the small cave where the voices originated. Two men in military uniforms sat against the rock wall, both clearly wounded. One had his leg splinted with pieces of wood and cloth. The other held his left arm against his body as if his shoulder was injured. They looked exhausted and scared. Maria recognized the uniforms and equipment immediately. These were Navy SEALs from the mission, probably the only other survivors of the ambush. She watched them for several minutes to make sure they were not being used as bait by enemy fighters. When she was satisfied that they were alone, Maria made a decision that would change all their lives. She cleared her throat softly and called out in a quiet voice. The two men spun toward the sound and raised their weapons with lightning speed. Maria slowly raised her hands and identified herself as Staff Sergeant Santos from the support team. The relief on their faces was obvious even in the growing darkness. The SEAL with the broken leg was Petty Officer Jake Morrison, a demolitions expert from Team 6. His partner was Chief Petty Officer David Kim, a communications specialist who had taken shrapnel in his shoulder during the ambush. Both men had been hiding in the cave system since the fighting ended, hoping for rescue that never came. Morrison's leg was badly broken, and he could not walk without help. Kim's shoulder wound was still bleeding slowly, and he was getting weaker as the hours passed. They had managed to stop the worst of the bleeding, but both men needed medical attention soon or their conditions would become life-threatening. Maria examined their injuries using the light from a small flashlight. Morrison's leg was definitely broken, probably in two places. The makeshift splint was holding the bones in place, but any movement caused him severe pain. Kim's shoulder had multiple pieces of shrapnel embedded in the muscle, and infection was already starting to set in around the wounds. The three survivors faced an impossible situation. They were at least 15 miles from the nearest friendly outpost, surrounded by enemy territory, and two of them could barely walk. No one knew they were alive, so no rescue mission was coming. They could stay hidden and hope for the best, or attempt a dangerous journey through hostile mountains. Maria looked at the two wounded SEALs and thought about her grandfather's teachings. He had always said that the strong must help the weak, and that courage was not the absence of fear but action despite being afraid. She made a decision that would either save them all or get them killed. They were going home together or they were not going home at all. Maria looked at the two wounded SEALs and knew that getting them home would be the hardest thing she had ever attempted. Morrison could not put any weight on his broken leg, and Kim was growing weaker from blood loss with each passing hour. They had no radio contact, no air support, and no one even knew they were alive. The nearest American outpost was 15 miles away through some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. But Maria had not survived this long by giving up when things looked impossible. Her grandfather had taught her that every problem had a solution if you were willing to think creatively and work hard. She spent the first hour after dark gathering materials to build a makeshift stretcher for Morrison. Using her rifle cleaning kit, some parachute cord, and pieces of wood from damaged trees, she constructed a simple but functional carrier. The stretcher was not comfortable, but it would allow them to move Morrison without causing more damage to his broken leg. Maria tested it carefully to make sure it would hold his weight over rough terrain. Kim insisted he could walk on his own despite his shoulder wound, but Maria could see that he was struggling just to stay upright. They began their journey just after midnight when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. Maria had studied the terrain during daylight and chosen a route that avoided known enemy positions while staying in areas with good cover. The path would be longer and more difficult, but it offered their best chance of reaching friendly territory without being spotted. Moving through the mountains with 2 wounded men was like trying to solve a puzzle that changed with every step. Maria had to find paths that were gentle enough for Morrison's stretcher, but still provided cover from enemy observation. She walked point, checking each section of ground before allowing the others to follow. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter, and every sound might bring death. The first night they managed to cover only 2 miles before exhaustion forced them to find shelter. Maria located a small cave hidden behind a wall of fallen rocks, where they could rest during the daylight hours. She helped Morrison get comfortable and checked Kim's shoulder wound. The bleeding had slowed, but his skin was getting hot to the touch, which meant infection was spreading. Kim needed antibiotics and proper medical treatment, but all Maria had was her basic first aid kit. She cleaned his wound as well as possible and gave him some pain medication from her supplies. Morrison was handling his injuries better, but she could see that the constant pain from his broken leg was wearing him down mentally as well as physically. During their first day in hiding, enemy patrols passed near their cave 3 separate times. Maria could hear the Taliban fighters talking as they searched the area for any signs of the missing Americans. The voices came so close that she could have reached out and touched the boots of one fighter who stopped just outside their hiding spot to rest. Maria held her breath and kept her hand on her rifle while praying that neither of her wounded companions would make a sound. Morrison bit down on a piece of cloth to keep from crying out when pain shot through his leg. Kim pressed his face against the cool rock wall and tried to control his breathing. For 10 terrifying minutes, the enemy fighters sat outside their cave discussing where the American survivors might be hiding. When the patrol finally moved on, Maria felt like she had aged 10 years in those few minutes. They had been seconds away from discovery and certain death. She made a mental note to find better hiding places for future rest stops. Her grandfather had always said that luck was just preparation meeting opportunity, and she needed to be better prepared. The second night of travel went more smoothly. Maria had learned from the first day's mistakes and found a route that avoided the main patrol paths. They covered almost 4 miles before finding shelter in a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural fortress. The location provided excellent concealment and multiple escape routes if they were discovered. Morrison's condition was stable, but Kim was getting worse. His fever was higher, and he had trouble staying alert during their rest periods. Maria knew that infection from untreated wounds could kill him, just as surely as enemy bullets. They needed to reach medical help soon, or Kim might not survive the journey. On the 3rd night, they encountered their closest call with death. Maria was leading them along a narrow ridge when she heard the sound of voices approaching from below. A large enemy patrol was moving up the same path they needed to use. There was no time to find another route, and nowhere to hide on the exposed mountainside. Maria quickly found a small depression in the rocks and helped Morrison and Kim squeeze into the tiny space. She threw her poncho over all 3 of them and pressed her body against the ground. The enemy fighters passed within arm's length of their hiding spot, their boots crunching on loose stones just inches from Maria's head. One Taliban fighter stopped directly above them and seemed to sense that something was wrong. He stood perfectly still for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Maria could smell the tobacco on his breath and hear his radio crackling with messages from other patrol members. She prepared to fight if they were discovered, knowing that 3 wounded Americans would not be taken alive. Finally, the fighter moved on to catch up with his patrol. Maria waited until she could no longer hear their voices before allowing her companions to move. They had survived another close encounter, but each one used up more of their rapidly diminishing luck. They needed to reach safety soon before their luck ran out completely. By dawn of the 4th day, they could see American positions in the distance. Forward operating base. Chapman looked like a mirage shimmering in the early morning light. They were still 5 miles away with the most dangerous terrain yet to cross, but for the first time since the ambush, Maria allowed herself to hope that they might actually make it home alive. The final 5 miles to forward operating base Chapman were the longest of Maria's life. She could see the American flag flying over the base in the distance, but between them and safety lay the most dangerous terrain yet. The last stretch of their journey would take them through a valley that enemy fighters used as a main supply route. There was no other way to reach the base without adding another day to their journey, and Kim did not have another day. Chief Petty Officer Kim had developed a high fever during the night, and his shoulder wound was showing clear signs of serious infection. Red streaks were spreading down his arm, and he could barely stay conscious for more than a few minutes at a time. Morrison was in better shape physically, but 3 days of constant pain had pushed him to his mental breaking point. Maria knew that both men were depending on her completely to get them home alive. She waited until the early morning hours when enemy activity was usually at its lowest. The Taliban fighters preferred to move supplies and personnel during the middle of the night, which meant dawn was often the safest time to cross their territory. Maria helped Morrison onto the makeshift stretcher and supported Kim as he struggled to stay on his feet. The descent into the valley was treacherous. Loose rocks threatened to start an avalanche with every step, and Maria had to test each foothold carefully before trusting it with their weight. Morrison gritted his teeth against the pain as the stretcher bounced over rough ground. Kim stumbled repeatedly and would have fallen several times if Maria had not been there to catch him. Halfway through the valley, they encountered a problem that almost ended their journey. A Taliban checkpoint had been established at the narrowest part of the route, exactly where Maria had planned to cross. 4 enemy fighters sat around a small fire, drinking tea and checking vehicles that passed through their position. There was no way around the checkpoint without climbing back up the mountainside and losing precious time. Maria studied the situation carefully and made a desperate decision. She would have to eliminate the checkpoint to save her wounded companions. Her grandfather had taught her that sometimes violence was the only answer to an impossible problem, but that did not make it any easier. She positioned Morrison and Kim behind a large rock where they would be protected from stray bullets. Using skills learned from years of hunting with her grandfather, Maria stalked the enemy position with deadly patience. She moved like a ghost through the rocks and shadows, getting within 50 yards of the checkpoint before any of the Taliban fighters sensed danger. When she opened fire, the battle was over in seconds. Her marksmanship training and the element of surprise made the outcome inevitable. Maria quickly checked the checkpoint area to make sure no other enemy fighters were nearby. She found a working radio and realized she could finally contact the base to request help. But when she tried to use the Taliban radio, she discovered that she did not know enough of their language to communicate effectively. The radio would be useless to her. She returned to her wounded companions and helped them continue their journey toward the base. They were now less than 2 miles from safety, but Kim was getting worse with each passing hour. His fever was so high that he was starting to become delirious, calling out names of people who were not there and talking to his mother as if she were walking beside him. As they climbed the final ridge before the base, Maria could see American soldiers on guard duty at the front gate. The sight of those familiar uniforms filled her with hope and determination. They were going to make it home. Her grandfather's lessons about never giving up had carried them through the darkest hours, and now salvation was just a few hundred yards away. The guards at the gate could not believe their eyes when Maria appeared out of the morning mist, supporting 2 wounded SEALs who could barely walk. Sergeant Mike Johnson, who had been on duty since midnight, thought he was seeing ghosts. Staff Sergeant Santos had been listed as killed in action 3 days ago. There was even a memorial service planned for later that week. Johnson called for medics and officers while helping Maria get Kim and Morrison through the gate. Within minutes, the base was buzzing with activity as word spread that the dead had returned to life. Major Williams ran from the command center still wearing his pajamas and slippers, unable to believe the reports he was hearing over the radio. Medical teams immediately began treating Kim and Morrison, while Maria sat on a nearby bench and watched the controlled chaos around her. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize Kim's condition, while others examined Morrison's broken leg. Both men were alive, and that was all that mattered to Maria at this moment. Major Williams approached Maria with tears in his eyes. He had signed the casualty report listing her as killed in action, and now she sat before him like a miracle. He wanted to know everything that had happened, but first he needed to make sure she was not seriously injured. Maria's own wounds were minor compared to what her companions had suffered. As news of Maria's return spread throughout the base, soldiers gathered to see the woman who had come back from the dead. The story of her survival and rescue of 2 wounded SEALs spread quickly through the military community. Within hours, reporters were calling to ask about the female soldier who had accomplished the impossible. Kim and Morrison both survived their injuries thanks to Maria's actions. Kim's infection was treated with powerful antibiotics, and Morrison's leg was properly set and placed in a cast. Both men credited Maria with saving their lives and insisted that she receive recognition for her extraordinary courage and skill. Maria was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in combat, one of the highest honors the military can bestow. Her story became legendary among soldiers serving in Afghanistan and inspired countless others to never give up in the face of impossible odds. She proved that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes those given up for dead can return to perform the greatest acts of service. But for Maria, the greatest reward was seeing Kim and Morrison alive and recovering from their wounds. Her grandfather would have been proud. 3 months had passed since Maria's incredible rescue mission, but the memory of those 4 terrifying days in the mountains remained as clear as if they had happened yesterday. She stood at the window of her new quarters at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, watching young soldiers train on the obstacle course below. Everything about her life had changed since that morning when she walked through the gates of Forward Operating Base Chapman, carrying 2 wounded SEALs to safety. The Silver Star medal sat in a wooden box on her desk, along with letters from military commanders around the world praising her courage and skill. But the items Maria treasured most were the photographs Kim and Morrison had sent from their homes. Kim was shown playing catch with his young son in their backyard in California. Morrison stood beside his daughter at her high school graduation in Texas, using only a walking stick instead of the crutches he had needed for months. Maria had been promoted to Sergeant First Class and assigned to the Army's Special Operations Command, where her survival and tracking skills could be used to train other soldiers. The work was important and challenging, but it felt strange to be teaching lessons her grandfather had shared with a little girl in the East Texas woods many years ago. Those simple hunting trips had become the foundation for military training programs. Her new students were some of the toughest soldiers in the Army, men and women who would face the most dangerous missions around the world. But even these elite warriors listened carefully when Maria taught them about reading signs in nature, finding water in dry places, and moving silently through hostile territory. They understood that her knowledge had been tested under the worst possible conditions and proven to save lives. The story of Maria's rescue had spread far beyond the military community. Schools across America invited her to speak to students about courage, determination, and the importance of never giving up. She accepted some of these invitations because she remembered being a young girl herself, dreaming of adventures while listening to her grandfather's stories about surviving in the wilderness. During one school visit in her hometown in Texas, Maria met Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, her old 5th-grade teacher. The elderly woman had tears in her eyes as she hugged her former student and told her how proud the entire town was of what she had accomplished. The local newspaper had published a long article about Maria's rescue mission, and the mayor wanted to name a street in her honor. But fame brought challenges Maria had never expected. Reporters still called regularly asking for interviews about her military service. Movie producers wanted to buy the rights to her story for Hollywood films. Publishers offered money for her to write books about survival and military life. Maria turned down most of these requests because she believed her story belonged to all the soldiers who served, not just to her. The hardest part of her new life was dealing with people who saw her as a symbol rather than a person. Some treated her like she was somehow superhuman, as if ordinary rules and limitations did not apply to her. Others seemed to expect her to be perfect all the time, never making mistakes or having bad days like everyone else. Maria missed the simple relationships she had enjoyed with fellow soldiers before becoming famous. Back then, people knew her as a competent and reliable team member who could be counted on during difficult situations. Now many people seemed more interested in meeting the hero from news stories than getting to know the real person behind the reputation. One evening while reviewing training schedules in her office, Maria received a phone call that changed her perspective on everything that had happened to her. The caller was Amanda Morrison, the wife of the SEAL she had helped rescue. Amanda was crying as she thanked Maria for bringing her husband home alive to meet his new baby daughter, who had been born just 2 weeks earlier. Morrison had not been expected to survive his injuries when he first arrived at the military hospital in Germany. The broken leg had developed complications, and doctors worried about permanent nerve damage that might leave him unable to walk normally. But Morrison had fought through months of painful physical therapy, motivated by his desire to return home to his family and his gratitude to the woman who had saved his life. Amanda told Maria that her husband talked about the rescue constantly, especially about Maria's refusal to leave him behind when carrying him, made the journey more dangerous for everyone. Morrison had made his wife promise to call Maria and tell her that their new daughter's middle name was Marie, chosen to honor the woman who had made it possible for her father to come home. The phone call reminded Maria why she had risked everything to save 2 wounded soldiers. It was not about medals or recognition or becoming famous. It was about families staying together and children growing up with their parents. Every danger she had faced during those 4 days in the mountains was worth it to hear. The joy in Amanda's voice as she talked about her complete family. Kim had recovered completely from his shoulder wounds and returned to active duty with the Navy SEALs. He sent Maria regular updates about his missions, always ending his messages with thanks for giving him the chance to continue serving his country. His parents had visited him at the base and asked him to deliver a handmade quilt to Maria as a token of their gratitude for saving their son's life. Maria realized that her grandfather had been right about many things, but most importantly about the responsibility that came with having special skills and knowledge. He had always taught her that abilities meant nothing unless they were used to help others when help was needed most. The rescue mission had been her chance to live up to those lessons, and she had not let him down.